It's week 6, and you're listening to the Beyond Unreal podcast. I am the White Dragon.
And this is Sir Briz.
All right, so it was a slightly quieter week on the development front. Obviously, there was still a lot of commits, more content type stuff.
Yeah, most of them were fixing up a lot of bugs that were in the code and adding a whole bunch of content got added for weapon sounds and pickup sound. The layout of some of the levels was tweaked a little bit. The pickups in some of the levels were tweaked. There was a new test map added by Nick that's a more 1 versus 1 type of level. In terms of gameplay on the alpha, there was not very much movement.
Right. I think part of that is it sounds like Steve Pool's is still on vacation and he'll be back on Monday. So I think when he comes back, we'll see a flurry of activity there. Now, one thing that did happen actually today when we recorded this on Friday, Flack went and set up a UT3 server. I think that they're probably going to use that machine eventually to set up UT4 playtests.
Yep.
But for now, it was UT3, so we've been playing that.
Yep.
I kind of have mixed feelings about it because it's fun to play with the people on the forums, but I really hate UT3.
Well, it doesn't help that you stink at it. So.
No, yeah. So I've been playing a lot of 2004. I'm not even near as good as I was back at its height. And, now I've been at it a couple of weeks and I was actually starting to play good. I was actually hanging with them. And then went over to UT3 and it's like all of the timings and how fast things go, it's all completely different. And so I was completely sucked at it again.
Yep. Yeah, it's hard to adjust to. It's kind of like playing 2K4 a lot and going back to the original UT because the original UT, the movement is much more down to the ground and the dodge is a lot lower. Can't move as far with it. It's interesting to switch between the different UTs and see how the weapon balance works in them and how the movement feels in each of them. Especially between 2K4 and the other games, it's hard to switch just because 2K4 gameplay is a lot different than the other games.
But it's not just that all of the values are different. There's just certain things about UT3 that really get on my nerves. So I think the one that bothers me the most is you just can't see squat.
Yeah.
Anytime that there's a character, I mean, I can see it and I'm shooting at them, but I just don't have the pinpoint accuracy that I have in 2004. So we were playing in Heat Ray, and it was just Briz and I shooting back and forth with shock rifles, and it went on forever because neither of us could hit with a shock rifle. And you have to get more hits in to kill somebody with it, too. I think it's like 4 or 5 versus 3 for 2K3. I just couldn't hit the broadside of a barn.
Yeah. Well, and another thing, I mean, for both of us, I think the vast majority of our experience with UT is actually in 2K3 and 2K4.
Oh, yeah.
We played probably thousands of hours. We played competitively. It absorbed a lot of our time. In UT and UT3, we didn't really do all that much, and the competitive scene in UT3 never really took off.
No.
I remember playing in several matches in UT3, CTF matches. It was a lot different from 2K4. It was a lot harder to see people, and my skill kind of lives on defense and flag return. For me, chasing down flag carriers in UT3 was a nightmare. It was just impossible. Part of that is there's really not any good CTF map that's stock in UT3. And what I noticed tonight when we were playing deathmatch is there's not really any great deathmatch maps, stock deathmatch maps in UT3 either.
They're all kind of okay, but there's nothing that really super stands out.
Yeah. And the other thing is, even though these maps are supposedly in different environments, they all feel like they're in the exact same place. Like, they just all have the same kind of lighting scheme. It's kind of gloomy, and they're...
Really, the Asian-themed maps are the only ones that feel significantly different.
Yeah. We played Shangri-La, and that was different. Like, it feels a little bit different, but still, like, the way the architecture's laid out, the gloominess and the brownness of everything, it's kind of all shared across the board in UT3.
So this brings us to the live stream that they had this week. And they actually addressed some of my questions, which I was happy about. Chris Perna got into a little bit about the visual style. It was really interesting the way that he approached it, because I think a lot of people wanted him to come in and say, hey, it should be this kind of a style, like UT3 was dark and gritty, so what are we going to go with the new one? And he didn't say that. In fact, what he said was, we haven't discovered it yet. Like, you guys need to make concept art. We'll see this element and this element are kind of the same, and we'll start to get that theme together. But right now we're discovering it, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing that he said was the visual clarity. And this goes to what we were talking about in UT3. It's just really hard to see things. And he was saying, when you look at UT99, it was very easy to see characters. And it wasn't just because the textures were more simple and the environments were more simple. There was decisions that they made where in UT99, they wanted details to be clear and sharp. Whereas in the UT3 era of games, they really relied on post-processing effects and really complicated models and everything to give this illusion of that things were really detailed. But it was always kind of like you just got a sense that it was detailed. It wasn't, that object wasn't clear. It wasn't sharp.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that a lot of people complained about in UT3. The graphics options give you enough rope to hang yourself with. You can, if you turn on every graphical option they give you, the game just looks awful. All the depth of field and bloom that is supposed to make it look really good just makes the edges of everything look blurry. As hard as it is to see things in the game, with all those options turned on, it's 100 times harder to see. Okay, that's hyperbole, but it's a lot harder to see.
Yeah. The game looks really good on high details, but it doesn't play very well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It's hard to see things.
It's interesting, too, because if you look at... So kind of the parallel in Gears of War land to UT3 is Gears of War 2. And that was a game as well that was very blurry looking. They relied on motion blur and depth of field a lot to make things look like they look really good. And the distinction between when they switched to Gears of War 3 and they had a much more advanced lighting model was ridiculous. Like, playing Gears of War 3 multiplayer, it's so much easier to see enemies in Gears of War 3 than it was in Gears of War 2. Now, it does still have some of the same problems of when there's so many busy things in the background, it's still hard for your eye to be drawn to the elements that you want to see. But just changing the lighting model alone makes a huge difference. And this is something I brought up in the thread in the forums. It's called Thoughts on Visual Clarity or something like that. Chris posted some screenshots of Deck. One thing that I thought that he kind of left out of his post was what Deck looked like in the UDK UT demo, where they opened up the top and they let a lot more light into the level, and it just looks so much better. With just that change to the level, there's so much more light and the colors are more varied. It looks a lot better.
The lighting definitely makes a difference, but I think this visual clarity thing is probably going to go even further than that. So one of the things that I thought was always done really well in the original Deck level was if you looked at the floor, it was just a playing space. And it was very clear where you were playing, and when you saw characters, you knew where they were. But when you looked up, that was where all the detail was. And the ceilings in Deck are really cool looking. They just have some really cool architecture when you look up. And so they were able to, through choosing the right textures and colors, and they're able to make it so that you could easily differentiate between the characters and the environments and have the environment still look detailed. You look at UT3, there's just junk everywhere. In the UT3 Deck, the floor consists of all these panels, and some of the panels are like broken and are offset from the others.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what makes it busy. And I think that this is going to go into a lot of decisions. There was a thread where people were saying, hey, we should have like little robots that follow the players around. Well, that's going to be a distraction that could detract from the visual clarity.
Yeah.
Right now, when you look at some of the pickups, you get these huge flares on the screen, which look cool, but that could distract from the visual clarity and might be gone.
Yeah. The thing is that between UT and today, there's a lot of changes in the way engines work, right? So we're definitely going to still see things like bridges in deck that are built out of a static mesh that has some kind of level of detail to it. But I think the idea is those static meshes shouldn't be big jagged blocks. Like if you look at a lot of levels in 2K3, 2K4, Citadel comes to mind really easily because I played that level so much. But there's a lot of places in Citadel where there's these spiky static meshes sticking out, and because of the way they're formed, the collision boxes are just ridiculous, and running into those was so easy.
Or Chrome. Chrome was probably the worst one on that respect.
Yeah, or Geothermal. That was another one.
I remember in Orbital has those really wide walkways.
Yeah.
But you'll notice nobody ever touches the walls. Like the wall is lava. If you touch that, you're gonna get stuck on something. You're gonna die.
Yeah.
Going on, so they addressed some of my questions, and I thought that their answers were really interesting. They weren't what I expected. So one of the things was I asked, what was some stuff from the other games that you guys thought didn't work out. I really thought that they were going to say Mr. Crow and Gorge, but he really focused on the visual clarity. I think it's important because this seems to be the design philosophy, not necessarily the art feel, but the design philosophy that they seem to have gotten wrong in some of the other games that they got right in UT99. But another thing that I thought was interesting was we asked what was some of the elements from UT99 and the original Unreal that they really liked. And almost all of them mentioned the Nolly stuff.
Yeah.
And it's a huge part of UT. Eternal Caves, Lava Giant, Face, Agony. There was a couple of other castle levels. Curse. These are all used that Nolly set, especially the bricks and things like that. It was a very large portion of the maps in UT99. And in 2K3, it's completely non-existent.
Yeah.
Like, Curse is not an alley-themed level anymore. It's a nightmare-themed level.
Yeah.
And the blocks are really big, and everything looks kind of satanic or something.
Yeah. Well, and Curse was another level where there was spikes hanging off of everything, and getting stuck on something happened all the time.
Mm-hmm. That, I think, could be a place where we could look for inspiration for sure. Another thing that they mentioned was, in the original Unreal, the thing that was really cool about that engine was fire and the plasma effects.
Yeah.
So you've never seen anything like that in Game C4. And when you think back on it, it's like, wow, actually, yeah, that was a really huge part of the look. There was torches everywhere. And there was maps like Fractal had that huge beam in the top of it.
Yeah.
You look in 2K3, not so much.
Well, and you look at UT3, and if you think it's gone in 2K3, 2K4, it's completely non-existent even in UT3.
I think that they realized that because later on, I think it was with the Titan pack, they introduced Dark Match, which is a map that's basically nothing but those.
Yeah.
And it's my favorite map in UT3. It also brings up an interesting point with the engine that we have, because these sorts of effects are mind-blowing in Unreal Engine 4.
Yeah.
Because you can't just do fire. You can do fire with thousands of little particles so that when your rocket goes through the fire, embers fly everywhere and light up the scene dynamically. And I mean, the sort of things that you can do with that are crazy.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see what people are able to pull off. The engine itself is capable of a significant level of detail. I mean, the Elemental demo, for example, is just ridiculous. The amount of particle effects that are going on in that scene and having it perform fairly well is really unbelievable. It does kind of remind you of that original Unreal Engine spirit. That's something that you didn't really see a lot of in any game, really, that came out of Unreal Engine 2 or Unreal Engine 3. There just wasn't a lot of particle effects.
No.
And right out of the gate with Unreal Engine 4, they've just been showing sample after sample of just unbelievable particle effects.
Yep. I think that Epic wants to show the engine off. And so it will be interesting to see how they balance those two factors, right? You're going to keep things really, really clean, but we also want them to look good, because I think that the last thing people want is a cartoony look like 2004.
Yeah.
At least for me. I want there to be clean, but I thought UT99 was clean. and still detailed.
I've mentioned this a few times on the forums, and we kind of talked about it last week. There was something in UT that I would call the quote-unquote Leandry touch. Every level felt like they had come in and done something to it to turn it into an arena. It wasn't just like, oh, this is a mining facility, and so you're going to fight in a mining facility. It was like Leandry came in and changed the architecture and the layout specifically to make it functional for the tournament. In 2K3 and 2K4 and even in UT3, there's none of that. This whole Necros thing that they did in UT3 was probably the closest to the Leandry touch in that game, but it really didn't work out in UT3, I don't think, because it wasn't just a touch, it was the definition of the vast majority of the levels, and it kind of, to me, made UT3 levels unmemorable. Like, we've talked about this on IRC several times, that you don't really remember levels in UT3. When somebody says, oh, in UT3, remember Strident, nobody off the top of their head remembers Strident or Reflection. Those are probably the best stock CTF maps in the game, and I still think most people wouldn't even know what you were talking about when you mentioned those two levels.
That's because nobody played CTF in UT3, but I digress. So
yeah, so anyway, in UT there was just places where part of it obviously was that they were using Unreal textures and it kind of lended into that, but I think that that's kind of what made it work in UT so well. There was areas of maps like Conveyor and Agony and all these different levels where, you know, there's a little bit of technology and it just had that Leandry touch in the level, and that's something that I really hope that they capture in this. It was like that. It
always felt like this was an arena that was like really popular, and when we first started using it, it was just a mining facility, but it's been popular, and over time we've made adjustments to it. It didn't feel like they built it from the ground up, right?
Yeah.
There was always kind of this, there was nothing artificial about it.
Yep. Probably the level that deviates from that the most is Hyperblast.
Yep.
And even in Hyperblast, it kind of had that same feel. Like, this was built for something, a space station.
There's history to it.
Yeah, but it was turned into an arena, and it was practical to do it this way. But again, it feels like they came in and cleared all the crap out and left the detail and put boxes in intentional places, and it was designed as an arena for the tournament. It wasn't just, oh, this is some random place that you're going to go fight in.
I do have to say, though, the things that Perna said in the cast were really encouraging to me. I feel like I was a little concerned because he's the guy that did all of the super ugly monsters in Gears of War 3. And that was a look in Unreal Tournament 3 that I didn't like. That cast kind of showed to me that if there's any part of this game that we don't need to worry about, it's the art. And it seems like between him and all of the artists that we have going on in the forum right now, that this will probably be the strongest part of the game.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. So let's move on to the movement. Should be some changes in the movement this next week.
Yeah, hopefully.
Where do you think we're at right now?
There's been a lot of discussion about movement still.
Well, it definitely heated up past few days.
Yeah, so it kind of died down for a while, but then some people came back and made additional comments. Where it is right now, like, I don't think anybody disagrees that the movement that exists right now is maybe slightly not right in certain key ways. One of them, obviously, we made our strafing tests. Epic has seen those and have their thoughts, what they should do in the movement prototypes based on that.
Specifically, we're talking about the movement speed and the acceleration. It feels a little sluggish in UT4 right now.
Yeah.
Especially when you show it side by side with the original Unreal Tournament.
Yeah. I think that they also have noticed that it doesn't feel quite right on the edges of strafing. Like, Jim Brown is the only one that I've actually talked to specifically about it, but he even looked at it and was able to say, like, it doesn't look exactly right in UT4 right now. And so when Steve comes back, I'm sure that things will change on that front and we'll be able to see more progress. But where it stands right now, I think we just need to decide what the right values for the movement speed and the acceleration especially are.
Right. I think once you get those values right, which are really, in my opinion, the most important things to get right for this game to feel good, then you get into all this stuff about like the sprint and the dance moves and things like that. Now, personally, I think sprint is dead. It sounds like Epic is going to try and fix it again, but even when they explained what their logic was for it, everybody in the community was like, what?
Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense to me. There was at least 3 separate threads where almost everybody in the thread said, I don't like it. I like dodging. There was maybe like 1 or 2 people that argued, and they were mostly playing devil's advocate. It just seems like overwhelming support for getting rid of the sprint.
Yeah, and I I feel a little bit bad for Mysterio, because he came in and posted a couple of times like what Epic is thinking about adding
and kudos to him, because we really didn't know what they were thinking. We were like, why are they adding sprint? It was the last thing I expected them to try.
Yeah. But in response to his post, I think a lot of people posted things saying, oh, this is making me a little terrified about this game. Now I'm not so sure this is going to work out the way I hoped it would. For reasons like that I think that it's probably not going to work out, but...
I mean, they're trying everything. So that's why you're saying, like, Entropy just kind of got caught in the crossfire, because he wasn't, like, trying to argue in favor. He was just saying, this is what we were thinking when we were putting it in, because they were just trying things, you know? And it was the same thing with the wall dodge. It sounds like that they're still going to try and make that work.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of the people that were in favor of that mechanic felt like they've lost and they moved on, which I don't think is true. They're going to try and make it work, because they want to try everything and see if they can actually make it compelling before they actually give up on it.
Yeah. And I think that's true for all the stuff that they're adding. Like right now we've got multiple wall dodging, really.
Yeah.
We've got 3 wall dodges, and several people have complained because there's no value to multiple wall dodging right now. The second wall dodge just drops you to the floor pretty much, because
you can really only use it like on a lift, for instance.
Yeah, but even then it's kind of exploitable, because the way that you can dodge off of a lift right now retains a lot of your vertical momentum, and so lift dodging, if we can call it that, is another one of these goofy dodge movements that people are probably going to get frustrated with.
I mean, the way that the lift works right now reminds me a lot of how they worked in 2004. And I remember in 2004, there was always that situation where you jumped up and maybe you dodged off the wall, and you had like that one chance to get the guy.
Yeah.
And if you didn't get the guy from that position advantage, you were dead, because they were going to hit you when you landed.
Yep.
And now what you can do is you can dodge off the wall 2 more times.
Yep.
And I quite like that, actually. And I think that might have been the sort of thing that they intended on using it for. Not this being able to dodge 20 times off of the same wall to get literally anywhere that you want.
Yeah. Well, so I think it'll probably be balanced better. Right now, if you dodge off of a wall, the wall dodge that you do after that kills your vertical momentum and everything, and you basically just drop to the floor. So I don't think that it's quite right yet, but I do think that with some work, it can be balanced into something that has a good consequence in the game.
Once you get the right values for like the movement speed and so forth, some of these mechanics aren't going to make as much sense.
Yeah.
And at that point, you're going to have to make a decision on which one you actually want, right? Like, if you are going to have some really crazy dodging and advanced movement options, you're probably going to have a slightly slower movement speed. That's the way that it was in 2004, and, you know, it worked for that game. If you can have really fast movement speed, things like sprint don't really make sense anymore, because in order for sprint to actually do anything at that point, it would look ridiculous.
Yeah.
And same with like the super multiple wall dodge. I think when they did that wall dodge the first time, the movement speed was like, what, 800?
Yeah.
Between us, we're thinking it should maybe be 1200.
Yeah.
And at 1200, it's either going to look ridiculous, or you'll be moving so fast that you'll have no control over it.
Yeah. Well, and that was something too that Hypno said in one of the threads, that because the movement speed was so slow, it was quite easy for him to dodge off of the same wall and get to all these places, and his opinion was that it could be balanced better, and I think that's true for the most part, I do think that unlimited wall dodge probably has too much potential to be exploitable. You know, having additional wall dodges up to 3, which is what they have right now, I think makes sense as long as they can balance the mechanics right and make it so that the additional wall dodges aren't completely useless, but they are less effective than the first wall dodge, and they don't give you enough to just keep floating up in the air basically for 3 wall dodges whenever you jump off of a lift or do some other fancy type of movement.
Because a lot of people on the forums have kind of given the impression that they think I'm a UT99 fanboy and that I'm just going to automatically reject anything that's not UT99, which couldn't be further from the truth. My favorite game was Unreal Tournament 2003. I liked it even better than 2004, and 2004 was close enough that I was still happy. When UT3 came along, I was still very much in favor of the dodge jump and the UT2K3 way of doing things. And eventually, I kind of said, you know what, even though that's the gameplay that I prefer, it wasn't worth it. I wish that they hadn't put it in 2003.
Yeah.
So the perspective that we're coming from is we've kind of seen this game before and we know where it leads to.
Yeah.
And we didn't like it.
Yeah. It's probably the case that most people don't realize that you and I put in most of our time in UT probably in UT 2003. I probably played it for thousands of hours myself. I played it competitively. And so my favorite game, especially when we're talking about nostalgia, because that's typically what it comes down to, is these people are so nostalgic about X game. My favorite game, nostalgically speaking, is Unreal Tournament 2003. And I felt like they really ruined the balance that they'd created in UT 2003 with 2K4 by killing the height of dodge jumping and the power of wall dodging, and especially boost dodging and fast weapon switching.
Fast weapon switch is what really did it for me.
All of the things that they had in 2K3 were balanced well towards each other because of the fast movement and the high dodging and the floatiness. I'll say the fast weapon switching worked really well, and it also allowed you to focus on other weapons than the hit scan weapons, because you could switch to lightning and then to rockets and then to shock and then to lightning and mix up the kinds of weapons that you used. So the point that I'm making here is my favorite game was UT 2003, and it's the one that I remember the most. So I'm not coming at this from the angle of I played so much UT and I was so into UT that I was, and it was competitive and I knew everything about it. I knew more about UT 2003, but I'm not arguing for UT 2003 movement. We've already been through a complete refactoring of the UT movement. We've gone through this process before. And so it's harder for us to look at what's happening on the forums right now, which is, you know, the 2KX movement style is really being left out in the cold. The people that are talking right now are focused more on UT3 movement or Quake. Movement that doesn't even exist in the UT universe, which Quake, really any movement-based, quote-unquote movement-based arena FPS out there today.
Yeah, you do have to realize that this is really an argument right now between classic Unreal Tournament movement and something that's more Quake-like.
Yeah.
And most of these players that are coming in and saying it's not smooth, they're coming from ES Reality. One of the arguments that I see all the time that drives me nuts the most is it needs to be smooth. Why? Why does it need to be smooth?
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be smooth. I like it better jerky. Why? It's harder to tell where the player's going to go.
Yep.
It makes more varied gameplay. In Quake, you just feel like you're smoothly going along. Yeah, but like when you die, the decision that made you die probably happened like 10 seconds ago.
Yeah. And in UT, the combat is always in the moment. Like, predicting somebody almost doesn't matter as much as knowing exactly what to do when a particular situation arises. If they dodge out of an area, what are you going to do? If they drop down into a lower tunnel, what are you going to do?
I mean, I guess the thing that I'm trying to point out is just that we've played this before.
Yep.
3 times now.
Yep.
And I know where it leads to. I question sometimes if we're going on arguments that kind of don't really lead anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Because if we're going to say, oh, it should be more quick, like, I can tell you what the answer to that is going to be ultimately.
Yeah.
And frankly, Unreal Tournament 99 was the most popular game of the franchise. I know a lot of people have been saying how many people are online right now, but what they forget is that in the heyday, there was 10,000 to 15,000 people playing Unreal Tournament at any given time. Most of the servers were vanilla servers, and there were even more people playing Unreal Tournament than Quake 3 at the time in certain time periods. It was a successful game. And then you look at all of the other arena shooters that have come since Unreal Tournament and Quake 3 Arena. All of the Unreal Tournament games have had their degree of success. Then you look at all of the Quake clones like Warsaw and all these other things were dismal failures.
Reflex and Reborn are coming up, and
I have no hope for them.
Yeah. A lot of people have tried to cop that Quake 3 feel and copy the Quake 3 movement or copy the CPMA movement, and there's not a successful arena shooter out there right now.
Right. Well, so people keep saying, one of the arguments I hear is, I would really like to see something that has the Quake 3 movement and the Unreal Tournament weapons. It exists. It's called Noxic, and...
Yep. And the thing is that the gunplay in UT only works as an extension of the movement that exists in UT. And the movement in UT only really works as an extension of the gunplay. They're really designed together. The dodge was designed for the types of weapons that UT has and vice versa. And once you go in there and say, let's change movement, then you have to say, how is that going to affect weapons? And you can't look at movement in a vacuum, because movement affects all these other things. It will affect the size and scale of levels. It will affect the visual clarity of people that are in the level. It will affect the weapon balance. It will affect really everything that exists in the game.
Everything about the game. It's the most basic part of the game. It affects everything. For a specific example, shock rifle, right? Shock rifle would never work with strafe jumping, because strafe jumping is all about moving really quickly, and the shock rifle is all about killing something in one specific location that you predicted they might be close to.
Yep.
In Quake 3, because you're zooming across the map so quickly, shock rifle really isn't that big of a deal. We'll see where it goes in the next week, but that's all that we have time for today. As always, make sure to like and subscribe. We love comments, especially commenting on the actual YouTube video page. And we will try and respond to all of the comments that we see. And we'll see you guys next week.